The plate hit the floor before anyone had a chance to react. Maria Bishop stood in the doorway of the Covington Ranch kitchen, her hands still outstretched from where she had been carrying supper to the table, and she stared at the two boys who had just shoved every last dish off the surface and onto the floorboards with one deliberate sweep of their arms. Cornbread, salt pork, boiled beans, and a tin cup of buttermilk lay splattered across the rough pine planks, and neither boy looked even slightly ashamed of what they had done. The older one, Eli, 12 years old and built like a young steer, crossed his arms over his chest and stared at her with dark eyes that could have been carved from obsidian. His jaw was set in a way that reminded her brutally, uncomfortably of his father. The younger one, Caleb, just 9, didn't even look at her. He turned his chair around and sat backwards on it, resting his chin on the top rail, and gazed out the window at the darkening Arizona sky like she didn't exist at all. This was not the first meal they had refused. This was the fourth. 4 days in a row, every plate pushed away, every cup untouched, every word Maria offered returned with silence that was sharper than any insult. She had made biscuits from scratch that first morning. She had boiled coffee thick and sweet the way she'd watched the ranch hands take it. She had tried salt pork and she had tried beans and she had tried a dried apple pie from a recipe her mother had pressed into her hands on the morning she boarded the stage in Santa Fe, and none of it had worked. Not a single bite from either boy. And now this. Maria stood very still in the wreckage of supper, and she breathed slowly, and she did not cry. She was 26 years old. She had crossed 300 miles of territory, answered a letter that had been printed in a newspaper, and had made her stomach turn with uncertainty and secret hope. And she had arrived at a ranch that smelled like dust and horse sweat, and something woodsy and clean that she had eventually identified as cedar. And she had shaken the hand of a man named Vernon Covington, who was tall enough to block the sun and quiet enough to terrify her. And she had agreed to cook and keep house for a trial period that might lead to marriage. She hadn't bargained on warfare. She looked at Eli. She looked at Caleb's turned back. She looked at the ruined supper on the floor, and something settled inside her, something quiet and decided and stubborn as a root that goes down 20 feet before it branches. She knelt and she started picking up the pieces of cornbread. She didn't say a word. She didn't scold, didn't sigh loudly, didn't produce any of the outrage she could feel pressing at the back of her throat. She just picked up the food and she set it on the counter, and she got the rag from the nail by the pump and she wiped the floor. And when the floor was clean, she turned to the stove and she began making supper again from the beginning. It was Caleb who broke first, not with words, not yet. But his chair scraped slowly on the floor and he turned it forward again and he watched her hands as she worked the dough. She didn't acknowledge it. She just talked. Not to him exactly. Not to Eli either. She talked the way her mother used to talk in the kitchen back in New Mexico, half to herself and half to the air and half to the God she believed was always just on the other side of the wall listening. She said, "My mama always said cornbread only gets good when you've had to make it twice." Neither boy answered. She also said a ruined supper is the Lord's way of telling you that you needed to be in the kitchen a little longer. Still nothing. Said, "I used to burn everything. First year I cooked for myself, I burned water, I actually did it. You ask anyone in Santa Fe who knew me, they'll tell you. Maria Bishop, that girl who burned water." And it happened then, the thing she had not expected and could not have planned for. Caleb made a sound. Small, involuntary, poorly suppressed. A sound that was trying very hard to be a laugh and was not entirely succeeding. She kept her face turned to the stove and she kept right on talking. She talked while she mixed the dough again. She talked while she fried the salt pork until it was crisp and golden. She talked while she added another ladle of beans to the pot. She told them about Santa Fe and about the stage ride and about a rooster named Colonel who had chased her across her neighbor's yard for 3 full years before she finally made peace with him by bribing him with corn husks. She talked the way a river runs when it has found the shape of its own bed, steady and inevitable. And by the time she set the second supper on the table, Caleb had his elbows on the surface and was watching her with his chin in his hands. Eli hadn't moved. But his arms were no longer crossed. She set a plate in front of each of them, and she sat down at the table with her own plate, which was something she hadn't done before. She'd been serving them and then stepping back, eating alone at the counter the way she thought a housekeeper ought to behave. But tonight she pulled out a chair and she sat down among them like she belonged there, and she said, "I'm going to say grace." And she bowed her head and she said it, short and plain and without performance. When she looked up, Caleb was picking up his fork. Eli was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something complicated and raw and deeply frightened, and he picked up his fork too. They ate. They didn't speak, but they ate every bite. And Maria Bishop understood in that moment that whatever was happening here, whatever battle was being fought around this table, it was not really about food. It was about a mother they had lost, a betrayal they could not name, a secret grief so enormous it had swallowed every ordinary appetite they possessed. And she understood that she had just been trusted with the first small corner of it, which meant she had to understand everything. She had to understand the man who had brought her here. She had to understand what had broken in this house long before she arrived. She had to understand Vernon Covington, and she would have to do it without losing herself in the process. 3 months earlier, the newspaper had arrived at the small boarding house in Santa Fe where Maria Bishop had been living for 2 years, earning her keep by helping the landlady, a broad-shouldered woman named Mrs. Hargrove, with the laundry and the cooking. Maria had not been looking for a husband. She had not been looking for anything except some way to keep moving forward through the particular kind of loneliness that had settled on her after her own family's fall, her father's failed land deal, her mother's long illness, and the subsequent scattering of the Bishop household to the 4 winds. She had been 24 when her mother died, 25 when her younger sister married a dry goods merchant and moved to Tucson, 26 when she picked up the newspaper and read the advertisement almost by accident, the way you read something that happens to be in front of you when your mind is somewhere else entirely. Widower, the advertisement said, rancher in the Arizona Territory near Prescott, 2 sons, ages 10 and 12. Seeking a woman of steady character, good with cooking and household management, willing to consider permanent arrangement upon mutual agreement. No frills necessary. Honesty valued above all else. No frills necessary. There was something in that line that was so blunt and so honest and so undeceived about what the world was that Maria had read it 3 times in a row. And then she had written back. She had told the truth in her letter. She was 26, unmarried, not because she had been too particular, but because the chances had not presented themselves cleanly in a life that had been largely consumed by the care of others. She was a capable cook and a hard worker. She was not afraid of the frontier. She had opinions. She warned him in the letter with a small spark of humor, and she would not suppress them. She had her mother's Bible and her mother's cornbread recipe, and not much else of material value. She had sent the letter and told herself she was probably being a fool, and then the reply had come back in less than 2 weeks. Vernon Covington wrote the way he apparently did everything, plainly and with great economy. He confirmed the facts of his situation. He confirmed the facts of what he was looking for. He said he would appreciate it if she was willing to come and see the place for herself before making any decision, and that he would cover the cost of transport and accommodation either way, whether she decided to stay or go. He said his name was Vernon. He signed it that way, not V. Covington, just Vernon. She had left for Arizona 12 days later. The stage road into Prescott was brutal in late September, all red rock and sage, and a heat that wrapped around you like a second skin. And Maria had sat in the rattling coach with her trunk at her feet and her mother's Bible in her lap and tried to imagine what Vernon Covington looked like. She had constructed a careful, moderate mental portrait, medium height, perhaps weathered but not unkind looking. She had prepared herself for a man who was functional and decent but not particularly notable, a man who needed a good housekeeper and a steady presence for his children, and who would be, over time, someone she could respect and work alongside, and perhaps, in some quiet, modest way, care for. She had not prepared for what she found. Vernon Covington was waiting at the stage office in Prescott when the coach arrived, and the first thing Maria noticed was that he was looking for her with an expression she had not expected. Most men waiting for a hired housekeeper would have looked slightly impatient or vaguely assessing. He looked the way you looked when you were waiting for news that was going to determine something important, alert and still and very serious. He was taller than she had imagined. Dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, which put him somewhere in his mid-30s, she estimated. Broad through the shoulders. A face that had been weathered as she'd predicted, but that was more precisely structured than she had allowed for, with strong lines and deep-set eyes that were the color of Colorado River water in early spring, a kind of gray-green that shifted when the light changed. He was wearing working clothes, clean but not dressed up, which told her he hadn't made a performance of coming to meet her, and she appreciated that. He spotted her as she climbed down from the coach, and he came forward and he held out his hand. "Miss Bishop," he said. "Mr. Covington," she said. They shook hands like two people discussing a land purchase, and Maria looked up at him and thought with a sudden private clarity that she had made a serious miscalculation in her mental preparation, because this man was going to be a great deal more complicated than she had accounted for. The ranch was 18 miles southeast of Prescott, and Vernon drove her out in a 2-horse buckboard through country that was spectacularly indifferent to human concerns, all juniper and ponderosa pine, and red dirt roads that wound between ridges like something that had been carved by a river long gone. He pointed out landmarks as they drove. A particular butte that served as a navigation point. A creek that ran well even in dry season. The boundary fence of his land, which was more extensive than she had imagined from his modest advertisement. He didn't talk excessively, but what he said was always to some purpose, and she found, despite herself, that she was listening carefully to every word. He had 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, older men, experienced and reliable. He had a herd of about 400 cattle, primarily longhorns. The ranch had been established by his father 16 years prior, and Vernon had taken it over 8 years ago when his father passed. He'd been married for 7 years. His wife, Eleanor, had died 3 years before, and he said it simply and flatly and without embellishment, and Maria accepted it the same way, without offering the kind of excessive sympathy that she had learned people sometimes found more burdensome than comfortable. When they reached the ranch, she saw the house, which was built of stone and timber, and was larger than she had expected, though it had the particular unloved quality of a place where no one had been paying attention to the details for a while. The curtains needed washing, the porch needed sweeping, the kitchen garden was a ruin of dried stalks and weeds. But the bones of the place were good, and she could see it clearly, what it had been and what it might be again. The boys were waiting on the porch. Eli, who was 12 at the time, and Caleb, who was 9. They had the look of boys who had been instructed to be polite and had made a private decision about how much of that instruction they intended to follow. Eli gave her a single measuring look and then looked away. Caleb stared at her shoes with great concentration, as though the answer to something important was written on the toes. Vernon introduced them. Eli said, "How do you do?" in a way that communicated clearly that he did not care at all how she did. Caleb said nothing. Maria said hello and did not try to charm them, which she sensed correctly would have made things worse. She asked Eli if he could show her where the kitchen was, and he looked briefly startled, which was exactly what she'd intended, and he said he could. She cooked supper that first night, and it was a good supper, salt pork and beans and biscuits and a pot of strong coffee. She called them all to the table, and Vernon came in from the barn, and the ranch hands were settled in the bunkhouse with their own meals, and everything was arranged in a fairly ordinary way. The boys sat down and Vernon sat down and Maria set the food on the table, and that was when she understood something was wrong. Eli looked at the food. He looked at his father. He picked up his fork, put it down again, and said he wasn't hungry. Caleb shook his head when she offered him the biscuits. Vernon looked at the boys and then at his food, and he ate without comment, methodically and without pleasure, and Maria watched all three of them and thought, there is a hidden story in this room and I don't have any of it yet. She didn't push that night. The next morning, same thing. She made a breakfast that any ranch hand in 3 counties would have been glad of. Eggs fried in butter and cornbread and molasses. And the boys came to the table and sat in their chairs and looked at everything and ate nothing. She noticed that they ate between meals, raiding the pantry when they thought she wasn't watching, coming away with handfuls of dried apple or strips of jerky. They weren't starving themselves out of grief or protest. They were simply refusing, specifically and deliberately, to eat what she made, which meant it wasn't about hunger. It was about her. It was about what she represented. It was about the betrayal of sitting at their mother's table and accepting food from someone who was not their mother. She understood it now, standing in the clean kitchen after that second supper, listening to the sounds of 2 boys pushing back their chairs and going upstairs without being told to. The ordinary nighttime sounds of a household operating at some basic level of function. She could hear Vernon on the porch, where he sat most evenings with a cup of coffee gone cold, looking out at his land in the particular way of men who find the open space necessary for something they cannot quite do inside. She dried her hands on a cloth and went out to the porch. He didn't look at her when she came out, but he shifted slightly in his chair in a way that acknowledged her presence. She had noticed he did that. He was always precisely aware of where people were in relation to him in a way that wasn't threatening but was very alert, the awareness of a man who had spent years reading land and animals for signs. She said, "They ate tonight." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard." "I sat down with them," she said. He turned and looked at her then, and in the half-dark of the porch she could see the complicated thing that moved through his expression and didn't stay long enough to identify itself. He said, "How did you manage that?" "I talked to them while I cooked," she said. "I didn't try to get them to talk. I just talked." He was quiet for a longer time. The night out here was extraordinary in a way she was still getting used to, the depth of the dark, the breadth of the stars, the smell of juniper and dry grass, and the distant, faintly mineral smell of the creek. He said, "Their mother used to do that." She turned to look at him. He was looking back out at the darkness. "She talked while she cooked," he said. "She said the kitchen needed conversation the way the garden needed water. She could talk for an hour straight without any particular encouragement." He paused. "The boys used to sit on the counter and listen." Maria felt the weight of that, of what she had accidentally echoed and what it must have done to them, the hidden pain of familiarity mixed with the dark knowledge that she was not a leaner. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "No," he said, and there was something rough in his voice. "Don't be. It worked, didn't it? They ate." "They ate," she confirmed. He looked at her then, and it was a long look, the kind that had a great deal behind it that was not being said, and she held his gaze because she was not a woman who looked away from difficult things. He said, "I should tell you that I am not an easy man to live with," she said. "Your advertisement was not designed to deceive." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and decided not to be. "No," he said. "I suppose it wasn't." She said good night and went inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a few minutes with her hand on the cool iron of the stove, and she thought about Vernon Covington, who had talked to her children while she cooked, and about Vernon Covington's face when he mentioned it, and about the fact that she was 26 years old and had never felt anything this complicated in her life. In the days that followed, something gradual began to happen at the Covington ranch, the kind of change that you can't point to at any single moment, but that you can feel accumulating in the air like weather moving in from a distance. Maria continued to talk while she cooked. She made it a practice, a deliberate habit. She talked about everything and nothing, the way the morning light came in at a different angle each day as autumn deepened, the history of the cornbread recipe, and the 3 failed attempts before her mother perfected it, the absurdity of Colonel the Rooster, the particular quality of Arizona silence which was different from New Mexico silence in ways she was still working out. Caleb began coming into the kitchen in the mornings before breakfast, not with any stated purpose, not asking for anything. He would simply appear in the doorway with his dark hair still rumpled from sleep and his feet bare on the stone floor, and he would find a place to sit and watch her. The first morning she didn't acknowledge it. The second morning she handed him a wooden spoon and asked him to stir. He stirred. He didn't speak. She talked enough for both of them. By the end of the first week, Caleb was stirring every morning without being asked. Eli was harder. Eli held himself back with a ferocity that Maria respected even as it broke something small and persistent in her chest each time she encountered it. He was not cruel. He was never rude in the direct way his first gesture of throwing the food had been rude, and she had never reminded him of it and never would. But he was enclosed in himself in a way that suggested the enclosure was structural, built over years of grief, and protected with the vigilance of a boy who had decided that opening up was simply too dangerous a business. She did not try to breach those walls. She just kept building the kitchen into the kind of place where walls felt a little less necessary. She started keeping a tin of dried apple slices on the counter with no instruction about them, available to whoever wanted them whenever they wanted them. By the third day, they were disappearing at a rate that indicated Eli was helping himself when she wasn't looking, which made her quietly, privately glad. She learned the rhythms of the ranch. She learned that Vernon was up before first light always, and that he drank his coffee on the porch in the dark before he went out to the barn, and that he ate his breakfast quickly and without conversation, not because he was unfriendly, but because his mind was already out on the land dealing with the 10,000 things that demanded a rancher's attention in the first hours of a day. She learned that he always came back to the house for the midday meal, even though it was more efficient to eat with the hands at the bunkhouse, and she eventually understood that this was not about the food but about checking on the boys, making sure they were where they were supposed to be, making sure the house was functioning. He was a man who made his care known through presence rather than words, and she found she could read it once she had the key. She also learned, slowly and with the particular patience she had developed through years of caring for her mother, that Vernon Covington was carrying a secret grief that was different from the boy's grief and in some ways more complicated. He didn't talk about Alina except for that one moment on the porch. But sometimes she would come into a room and find him very still in a way that had nothing to do with physical stillness, a stillness of the soul, and she understood that he was somewhere she couldn't follow, in some memory or some reckoning that he was making privately and continuously. She did not push him either. She cooked and she cleaned and she rebuilt the kitchen garden from its ruined state, digging up the dead stalks, and turning the soil and planting the winter things that could still go in before the real cold came, turnips and kale and a row of onions. She found that the barn cat, a large yellow tom of immense self-possession, had decided she was acceptable and began following her around the yard, which she found companionable. She wrote to her sister in Tucson, carefully and without excessive disclosure, and she wrote to Mrs. Hargrove in Santa Fe to say she had arrived safely and that the territory was extraordinary and that the coffee was excellent. She did not write that she was finding it increasingly difficult to think clearly in proximity to Vernon Covington, because she was not yet ready to acknowledge that even to herself. It happened on a Wednesday in mid-October, 5 weeks after her arrival, that everything shifted. It had been a good morning. Caleb had helped her make bread, actually helped, his small hands in the dough alongside hers, and he had talked for the first time, not much but enough, asking her questions about Santa Fe in a quiet, curious voice that was entirely different from his silence. She had answered every question carefully and honestly, and without making too much of the fact that he was talking, the way you don't make a sudden movement when a wild thing comes close to you. She was taking the bread out of the Dutch oven when Eli came into the kitchen and stopped. He watched her. He watched Caleb, who was sitting on the counter with flour on his nose. Something passed across Eli's face that Maria caught in her peripheral vision, something that was grief mixed with wanting and wanting mixed with fear, the terrible specific look of a child who needs something and does not know if it is permissible to take it. She set the bread on the table and she said, without looking directly at him, "Eli, will you slice that bread for me? The knife is on the board." There was a pause long enough to hold a conversation in. Then Eli crossed the room and picked up the knife and sliced the bread, carefully, correctly, in even pieces the way she had shown Caleb a week before, and that was all. He sliced the bread and set the knife down and took a piece and ate it standing at the counter with his arms crossed, which was such a profoundly Eli method of capitulation that Maria had to turn back to the stove to hide her expression. When Vernon came in for breakfast, he found all three of them at the table, the bread in the center, Maria and Caleb talking about the yellow cat, whom Caleb had decided needed a name. Vernon looked at the scene and then looked at Maria with that river water gaze of his, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was warm and specific and too complex to name at that early stage, and which she spent the rest of the morning trying not to think about. But then the harder thing happened. It was late afternoon, and she had gone out to the kitchen garden to pull some turnips, and she heard the ranch hands talking at the corner of the barn where they thought they were out of earshot. Two of them, the one called Pete, who was about 60 and had the manner of a man who had seen everything, and the younger one, a man called Jess, maybe 25, who had an unfortunate tendency to speak without thinking. Jess was saying, "She's not going to last. They never do." Pete said, "Give her time." Jess said, "She doesn't know what she walked into, about a leaner, about why she really—" He stopped talking. He'd heard something. Maria stayed very still behind the garden fence and did not move. Pete said in a quieter voice, "That's not your business to tell." "Somebody ought to tell her," Jess said. "When it's time," Pete said, "Vernon will tell her himself. Until then you keep your mouth shut." They moved away. Their voices became nothing. Maria stood in her kitchen garden with a turnip in each hand and the autumn sun going sideways across the mountains, and she felt the particular cold of a secret she didn't have, the knowledge that something important was hidden from her, something about Vernon Covington's death that was not what it appeared to be. She told herself it was not her business. She pulled her turnips and went inside. But she couldn't let it go, not entirely, the way you can't ignore a stone in your shoe even when you are determined not to stop walking. It pressed against her as she cooked supper. It pressed against her while she ate with the boys, Eli actually sitting forward in his chair now, both elbows on the table in a way she decided not to correct because forward and present and impolite was better than backwards and absent. It pressed against her while she washed up. When Vernon came in from the barn, later than usual, smelling of horse and cold air, and poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table while she finished cleaning the last of the pots, she said, without turning around, "Jess was talking about a leaner today." She heard him go very still. She said, "I wasn't trying to listen. I was in the garden." He said, "What did he say?" "Not much." Pete stopped him. She turned around and looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to tell me anything that isn't mine to know, but if there's something I should understand about this house and these children, I would rather hear it from you than come upon it sideways." He looked at his coffee cup for a very long time. He said, "Vernon didn't die of illness." She waited. He said, "She left. 18 months before she died, she left the ranch. She left me and the boys and she went to Prescott and she took up with a man named Farrow who ran the land office. She said she couldn't do it anymore. The ranch, the isolation, the life." He said it flatly, without embellishment, the same way he said everything, but she could hear the architecture of old pain behind each word. "She died of a fever 8 months later, in Prescott. I found out by letter." The kitchen was very quiet. Maria set down the pot she was holding. She said carefully, "The boys know she left." "Yes," he said, "they know. And they know she didn't come back." Yes, she understood now. She understood the wall around Eli, who was old enough to have known exactly what was happening, to have watched his mother choose to leave and not come back. She understood the particular shape of Caleb's silence, which was the silence of a child who'd been abandoned at an age when he couldn't have constructed any adequate framework for it. She understood the shape of Vernon's grief, which was not simple widower's grief at all, but something much more complicated. The grief of abandonment layered with the grief of loss layered with whatever he carried about his own failures and responsibilities in the marriage that had broken. She said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to all of you." He looked up at her then, and his face was doing the thing she had seen it do once before on the porch, the complicated motion of too many things at once, and she held his gaze steadily. He said, "I should have told you before you came. It's not something that should have been kept from you." "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't have been. Does it change things for you?" He asked, and there was something in that question that was very exposed and not entirely characteristic of the man she had observed for 5 weeks, a rawness that told her the question cost him something to ask. She thought about it honestly. "It explains things," she said. "It doesn't change what needs doing." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he nodded once and drank his coffee, and they stayed in the kitchen together for another half-hour while the night came down, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled, not talking very much but not needing to. It was the most comfortable Maria had felt since she arrived, which frightened her considerably. November came with a change in the air that the ranchers called the first breath, a cold front that swept down from the north and pushed the last of the warm season off the mountains overnight. Maria added a second quilt to each of the boys' beds without being asked, and started making a hot breakfast every morning instead of alternating with cold, and she found herself in the particular domestic rhythm that she had not experienced since her mother's house, the rhythm of caring for a household that was beginning, slowly and not without complication, to respond. Caleb had become her morning companion in the kitchen, as certain as the sun. He was a child of intense interior life who had been, she gathered, largely silent for the past 3 years in the specific way of deeply affected children who turn inward when the outer world proves unreliable. He talked to her now, carefully and in the particular currency of a 9-year-old, which was questions rather than statements. He asked her what everything was called in Santa Fe. He asked her about her mother, and she told him, and he listened with the focused gravity of a child who understood loss from his own experience. He asked her once, with the sudden directness that children produce without warning, whether she thought his mother had known she was going to die when she left. She took a breath and thought about how to be honest with a 9-year-old. She said, "I think your mother was very unhappy and very confused, and sometimes when people are that unhappy they make decisions that they might have made differently if they'd been well. I don't think she was thinking clearly about what she was leaving behind." Caleb thought about this for a long time, stirring the pot she'd given him. He said, "Papa doesn't talk about her." "That's how some people grieve," Maria said, "quietly and by themselves." "Is that wrong?" "No," she said. "It's just one way." Caleb said, "You talk while you do things. Even when you're by yourself, you talk." "That's my way," she said, and smiled at him. He smiled back, which was still something so new and so genuinely luminous that she had to look away to preserve her composure. Eli's change was slower, but it was no less real. He had started coming to the kitchen table in the evenings with a school book, working through the arithmetic problems the local schoolmaster sent home with the boys each week, and doing them at the table near the lamp while she cleaned up after supper. He didn't ask for help. But when he got stuck on a problem, there would be a particular kind of stillness from his direction, and she would say, without looking up from what she was doing, "What's giving you trouble?" And he would read her the problem, and they would work through it together with her at the counter and him at the table, neither of them making a ceremony of it. One evening he said, without preamble, "Miss Bishop." "Eli, why did you come here?" She set down the towel she was using to dry a pot. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with those dark, precise, exhausting eyes of his, and she understood that he was asking for the truth, and that anything less would be detected and punished with the withdrawal of exactly the small amount of trust he had extended. She said, "I was lonely and I needed a purpose. Your father's advertisement described a situation that needed what I had to offer. I thought it was worth finding out if it was a good fit." He processed this. He said, "Are you going to stay?" She took a breath. She said, "I want to if you'll have me." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly. Then he looked back at his arithmetic book and said, "The problem is this one here," and he read it to her and they worked it out, and he didn't bring up the question again that night. But when she was banking the fire to go to bed, he said from the stairs, "Good night, Miss Bishop," which was the first time he had said good night to her of his own volition since she arrived. She said good night back, and she stood at the cold stove with her hand pressed flat against the iron, and she said a short prayer of thanks to whoever was listening. It was the first week of December when Vernon kissed her. It was not planned. She was reasonably certain of that. She had come to know him well enough by then to understand that Vernon Covington was not a man who planned emotional events. He navigated them when they occurred, with the same careful, unglamorous competence he brought to everything else, and he was better at it than he gave himself credit for. They had been mending the fence at the south end of the kitchen garden, which had been broken by the autumn storms and needed the rails replaced before real winter set in. It was one of those crystalline December days that the Arizona Territory produced sometimes, sharp-edged and brilliant, the sky an impossible blue that hurt to look at, the cold clean and direct. Vernon was setting the rails and she was holding them while he drove the nails, and they had been working in companionable quiet for an hour when she made some observation about the angle of the light and how it reminded her of New Mexico mornings, and he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and something in the air between them became suddenly, electrically different. He set down the hammer. He stepped toward her. He said her name. Just her name, just Maria, with the particular inflection of a man asking a question he doesn't know how to phrase. She said, "Yes," which answered the question he hadn't asked aloud. And he kissed her there beside the kitchen garden fence, with the cold winter light coming sideways across both of them, and the yellow cat sitting on the garden wall watching them with great dignity. And it was not a practiced or theatrical kiss, but it was extraordinarily genuine, and she felt it in places she had not expected to feel anything, in the very center of herself where she had kept things carefully protected for a very long time. He pulled back and looked at her. He said, "I don't know how to do this properly." She said, "I don't think there's a proper way." He said, "I mean to ask you to marry me, not as a housekeeper arrangement, as a real marriage." She looked at him. She looked at the fence and the garden and the house beyond it with the smoke coming from the chimney. And she thought about Caleb in the kitchen in the mornings with flour on his nose and Eli at the table with his schoolbook, and the two of them eating her food and the feeling of this household shifting incrementally towards something that was beginning to resemble actual life. She said, "I'll need some time to think." He said, "Of course," and he meant it, and that was one of the things she was coming to love about him, that when he said something he meant it in the direct, uncomplicated way of a person who did not say things for strategic purposes. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it in the mornings while she cooked with Caleb at her elbow. She thought about it in the evenings while she listened to Eli working through his arithmetic and occasionally asking her to explain the reasoning behind a problem. She thought about it at night when she lay in the room they'd given her, which had belonged to some other iteration of this household before her, and had a window that faced east so the first light came through it every morning like a quiet daily announcement. She thought about the hidden story of this family, the betrayal of Alina's leaving, the dark past that had shaped these children into the specific shapes they were, the forced isolation the ranch imposed, the secrets she was still discovering at the edges of Vernon's history. She thought about the fact that she was not a leaner and did not want to be a leaner, and had her own history of loss and survival that was distinct and non-transferable. She thought about the way Vernon looked at her. Not the way a man looks at a woman he has selected for her utility. The way a man looks at a woman he is afraid of losing, which was a different thing entirely and meant that somewhere in the past weeks, without any ceremony or announcement, she had become someone to him. On the third day she went to find him in the barn. He was working on the harness, which needed a new buckle, and he looked up when she came in and did the thing he always did, which was to become very alert and very still. She said, "Yes." He set down the harness. He crossed the barn floor. He held out his hand, and she put her hand in it, and he held it for a moment with both of his, looking at their joined hands with the expression of a man who is attempting to understand something he doesn't quite believe yet. He said, "I will try to deserve this." She said, "So will I." They were married in January at the county courthouse in Prescott, with Pete and a woman from the neighboring spread named Clara Whitfield as witnesses, and with Eli and Caleb standing beside them in their good shirts, Caleb with his hair slicked down and Eli with his arms crossed, and his jaw set but his dark eyes watchful and present, and she thought, not entirely without some small hidden thing that might, in a very private and carefully protected corner, have been relief. The wedding supper that night was at the ranch, just the five of them and Pete and Clara, and Maria made a roast chicken with herbs from the garden and a dried apple pie and 2 kinds of bread, and there was fresh butter and strong coffee, and a small bottle of wine that Clara had brought from somewhere, and it was warm in the kitchen with the stove going full and the lamp turned up, and somewhere in the middle of it, during the apple pie, Eli laughed at something Pete said. It was a real laugh, unguarded, loud enough to surprise him into silence immediately after, and he looked quickly around the table and found no one making anything of it. Maria looked at her plate and felt something in her chest that she suspected was going to be permanent. The winter deepened. Maria learned the ranch's rhythms the way you learn a piece of music, slowly and then all at once. She learned which mornings Vernon came in from the barn needing silence first, and coffee second, and conversation never. She learned that Caleb got headaches when the weather changed and needed a cold cloth and no noise and would be fine in an hour. She learned that Eli had a gift for mathematics that was extraordinary and probably needed development beyond what the local school could offer, a fact she began quietly investigating through letters to the schoolmaster and to a teacher she'd heard of in Prescott who offered more advanced instruction. She learned that Vernon's reserved, containing manner was not indifference but something much more like a fundamental aloneness that had probably been native to him even before Eleanor and the ranch and the loss, and that the way to reach him was not to dismantle the reserve but to settle in alongside it, which was something she was able to do because she had her own particular solitude that she valued and needed. They were careful with each other at first. Carefully tender, carefully present, learning the domestic geometry of existing as a married couple in the specific environment of a working ranch in the Arizona Territory in the winter of 1887. She moved her few possessions into the main room of the house without particular ceremony. He made space for them without being asked. Small adjustments, small acknowledgments, the slow accumulation of a shared life. But there were moments, sudden and vivid and unguarded, that told her the depth of what was growing. One evening she had fallen asleep over her mending in the chair by the fire, which she almost never did, and she woke to find that someone had put the extra blanket over her and moved the lamp to a lower angle, and the fire had been stoked to stay even and warm. She sat with the blanket around her shoulders in the quiet house, and she knew it had been Vernon without needing to see or ask. One afternoon she had come in from the garden to find Caleb and Vernon at the kitchen table with the arithmetic book open between them, Vernon explaining something patiently while Caleb wrote figures in the margin. And the sight of it, the particular domestic ordinariness of it in a house that had been so long without ordinary things, made her have to take a breath in the doorway. One night in February, lying awake listening to the wind come off the mountains and shift around the corners of the stone house, he said in the dark, quietly, "I'm glad you came." She said, "So am I," he said. "I know I'm not easy," she said. "No one is. You're worth the difficulty." She felt him turn toward her in the dark. He said, "I think you might be the most honest person I've ever known." She said, "I had a mother who didn't see any point in dishonesty. It's not a virtue, it's just a habit." He made the sound that was trying to be a laugh again, and this time it succeeded, quietly, in the dark. And she heard the youth in it and thought about the boy he must have been before the ranch and the marriage and the leaving, and all the things that had accumulated into the particular kind of man he was now. She said, "Tell me something about yourself that nobody else knows." He was quiet. He said, "I wanted to be a schoolteacher when I was young." She turned her head to look at his profile in the dark. He said, "Before my father needed me on the ranch. I'd gotten halfway through enough schooling that it was a possibility. Then it wasn't." He paused. "I still read, every night, whatever I can get." She thought of all the evenings she'd thought him simply sitting on the porch and realized now that he'd probably had a book. She said, "What are you reading now?" He said, "Jules Verne. The boys got it from the library in Prescott." He paused. "Don't tell them I borrowed it." She laughed genuinely into the dark and felt him laugh too, and they lay in the February dark and laughed about Jules Verne, and she thought, "This is it, this exact thing. This is the particular texture of love when it is the right kind, the kind that has honesty at its center and humor at its edges and something very steady at its core." Spring came, and with it a crisis that Maria had not anticipated and which tested everything. One of the fence riders, a young man named Hargrove who worked for a neighboring spread, came over in early March to deliver word that there had been cattle rustling on the eastern properties and that there was pressure from the land office, Pharaoh's land office, to have some of the smaller ranches assessed and potentially challenged on their boundary claims. Pharaoh. Maria watched Vernon's face when that name came up, and she saw what it cost him to keep his expression level. Pharaoh was the man Aliner had left him for. And now Pharaoh, apparently in some position of bureaucratic authority in Prescott, was potentially able to interfere with the ranch's claim. Whether it was personal or simply the corruption that was endemic to Western land offices in this period, she didn't know. But the threat was real. Vernon spent 3 days riding out to assess his fence lines and gather his documentation, and Maria ran the household and kept the boys settled and tried not to let them see her worry. But Eli, who was 12 and not missing much, came to her in the kitchen on the second evening and said, "Is Papa in trouble?" She said, "There are people who would like to make trouble for him. Your father is smart and he has his papers in order. I believe he'll handle it." Eli said, "Pharaoh." The name dropped into the room like a stone. She looked at him carefully. He said, "I know about Pharaoh. I know what he is." His voice was very controlled. "I know what he did to our family." She set down what she was doing and she gave Eli her full attention. She said, "What do you want to say about it?" He looked at her with those obsidian eyes that had been the first thing she'd encountered about him, the barrier and the intelligence behind it simultaneously visible, and he said, "I want to say that if Pharaoh tries to take this ranch, I will not let him." She said, "You won't have to fight him alone. None of us will." Something moved in his face. He said, "You count yourself as part of this." She said, steadily and without equivocation, "I am part of this." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," and went back to his school book, and that was the most complete acceptance she had received from him yet, blunt and unembellished and completely genuine, and she turned back to the stove and kept her face neutral until she was certain she could trust it. Vernon returned on the 4th day with the documentation sorted, and a letter from the county recorder confirming the ranch's boundary claim as valid and recorded, and a second letter from a lawyer in Prescott who had been engaged by several ranchers to resist Pharaoh's overreach. The matter would take time, but it was in hand. He told her about it at the kitchen table that evening, after the boys had gone up. He spread the papers out and explained the legal situation clearly and without minimizing anything, which she had come to understand was his characteristic approach, and she listened and asked questions and understood that what he was doing, without naming it, was including her in the full reality of their situation, not protecting her from it. not simplifying it for her consumption, treating her as a full partner in understanding the threat. When he finished, she said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Nothing extra. You've been doing everything that needs doing." He paused. "I came back to a house that was running, to boys who were all right." He looked at her. "That's not nothing, Maria," she said. "No, I don't suppose it is." He said, "I want you to know that whatever happens with Pharaoh, and I believe we're going to be fine, but whatever happens, I intend to fight for this ranch. Not just for myself, for the boys, and for you." He said it plainly, the way he said everything. "You gave up your independence to come here. I don't take that lightly." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She said, "I didn't give up my independence. I chose this. There's a difference." He turned his hand over and held hers. He said, "Yes, there is." They sat like that at the kitchen table with the papers spread between them and the fire ticking down in the stove, and she thought that this was one of the most intimate moments she had experienced. Not a dramatic one, not a grand gesture, just the quiet weight of two people who had decided on each other and were sitting in the ongoing reality of that decision. By summer, the Pharaoh matter had been resolved entirely, the lawyer in Prescott having assembled enough evidence of Pharaoh's irregular practices at the land office to have him removed from the position and investigated by the territorial authorities. It was the kind of justice that was satisfying not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific, the dark past losing its hold, the hidden threat removed, the land safe. The boys flourished in ways that still occasionally stopped Maria in her tracks. Caleb had grown an inch and a half over the winter and had developed a focused, ferocious interest in the natural world that manifested in a collection of rocks and dried plants, and one preserved bird skull that he kept on his windowsill and could lecture extensively about. He was still quiet in the world generally, but in the kitchen in the mornings with Maria, he was expansive and funny and entirely himself, and she had the particular satisfaction of knowing she'd been there when that self had begun to emerge from its protective shell. Eli had been enrolled in the advanced instruction course with the teacher in Prescott, and was riding in twice a week on a spotted horse that Vernon had let him choose himself from a new acquisition at the ranch. His arithmetic was now genuinely startling, and his teacher had sent a letter to the ranch saying that Eli had what she called a rare mathematical mind that deserved serious cultivation. And Vernon had read this letter at the supper table, and the expression on his face was so precisely the expression of a man trying to contain something enormous that Maria had had to look very hard at her plate. Eli had said, with the studied nonchalance of a boy trying not to care too visibly about something he cared about very much, "It's just numbers." And Caleb had said, "It's not just numbers, you're brilliant and everyone knows it," with the blunt, devoted admiration of a younger brother who doesn't have his older brother's defenses. And Eli had thrown a biscuit at him, which was the most ordinary and affectionate thing she had ever seen him do. On a warm evening in July, 4 months into their marriage, Vernon found her in the kitchen garden at dusk when she was picking the last of the green beans, and he came to stand beside her in the way he did things without announcement, just present. He said, "I've been thinking," she said. "That's generally a sign of something." He said, "I'd like to expand the south pasture. There's a section of land adjacent that's come available that would double the grazing. It would mean a significant investment, but the long-term position of the ranch would be stronger." She said, "What's the hesitation?" He said, "It's a joint decision. It affects both of us." She straightened up and looked at him in the dusk light, the evening sky going amber and violet above the mountains, and she thought about the fact that he had consulted her, genuinely consulted her, not as a formality but as a partner. She said, "Can we service the investment without overextending?" He said, "Pete thinks so, I think so." She said, "Then I think you should do it." He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I trust your judgment on this ranch, Vernon. You know it better than anyone alive." He looked at her for a moment with the river water eyes she had come to know so well by now in all their variations, the morning version still dark with sleep, The working version focused and far, the evening version that settled on her in the particular way that still made something in her catch slightly and helplessly. He said, "I trust yours too. In case that wasn't clear," she said, "it's becoming clearer." He leaned forward and kissed her there in the kitchen garden in the dusk, and the yellow cat, who was occupying the top of the garden wall as was his custom, observed them with the expression of a creature who has seen this before and approves. In August, she knew she was expecting. She told Vernon on a Sunday morning before the boys were up, sitting at the kitchen table with the early light coming in at the east window, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, something that moved through the reserved structure of his expression like a current through water, something that was joy, unguarded and total, breaking the surface before he could contain it. He said her name. She said yes. He reached across the table and took her face in both his hands, which he had never done before, and he looked at her with an expression that was completely exposed, all the dark past and the hidden grief and the complicated years temporarily not present, just this particular moment of beginning, and she felt the warmth of it in every part of her. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I'm perfectly well." He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Coffee and some peace and quiet, which I'm aware is in short supply on this ranch." He laughed and got up and made her the coffee himself, which was not something he had done before, standing at the stove with great concentration the way a man will do something he doesn't entirely know how to do when he wants to do it specifically as an act of care. And the coffee was not quite as good as hers, but it was the best cup she had ever had. When they told the boys at breakfast, Caleb's face lit up with the uncomplicated joy of a 9-year-old who has been given uncomplicated good news. He asked immediately if it would be a boy or a girl, and was told they wouldn't know, and asked if he could be in charge of naming it, and was told that was a conversation for later. Eli was quiet. He looked at the table, he looked at his father, he looked at Maria, and then he said, "Are you going to be all right?" She understood the question completely. She understood that it was not a casual question. She said, "I intend to be. I'm very healthy and it's early days yet. I'll need your father's help and I may need both of you to take on a bit more around the house." She paused. "Can I count on that?" Eli said. "Yes," without hesitation. Caleb said, "I can cook now. I know how to stir things." She said, "You are absolutely going to be very useful." And Caleb beamed, and Eli allowed himself a small, complicated smile that she had come to understand was his maximum expression of satisfaction. And Vernon, behind his coffee cup, looked at his family with a quiet radiance that she thought might be the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. The pregnancy progressed through fall and into winter without significant difficulty, though the later months were harder, the cold more penetrating that year, and the ranch demanded physical things that Maria was increasingly unable to provide. She found herself dependent in a way she had never been, on Vernon and on Eli and on Caleb and even on Pete, who turned out to have some experience with expecting women from having had 6 sisters, and took to quietly appearing with extra wood for the fire and asking no questions about it. Clara Whitfield from the neighboring spread came over twice a week in the last 2 months, a solidly capable woman who had delivered babies and survived everything the frontier had produced, and who had become, over the past year, something genuinely approaching a friend. The baby came in March, a boy, arriving on a Thursday in a cold dawn with the wind off the mountains, and Clara's steady presence in the room and Vernon's hand in hers, which he held with a grip that was controlled and constant, and which was the only external evidence of what he was feeling inside. The baby was healthy. He cried with a thoroughness that seemed disproportionate to his size. He had a full head of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, a gaze of extraordinary vague focus that suggested he was already trying to assess the situation. Vernon held him in the morning light and looked at him for a long time and said absolutely nothing. Caleb, when he came in, said, "He's so small," with the reverence of a person in the presence of something unexpectedly miraculous. Eli looked at his father holding the baby and then at Maria in the bed, and he crossed the room and sat on the chair beside her and said, in a quiet voice that only she could hear, "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me." He said, "I know. I wanted to anyway." They named the baby Samuel, after Vernon's father, with William as a middle name for her own father, Samuel William Covington, and he was called Sam from the first day, and answered to it with gradually increasing accuracy as the weeks went on. The ranch in late spring with a new baby was a particular kind of beautiful chaos. The South pasture expansion had brought new cattle and new demands, and Vernon was up earlier than ever and worked later. But he came in every evening and found Maria and Sam in the lamplight, and the expression on his face in those moments was one she catalogued and kept, a quiet radiance repeated over and over. Caleb had been given jurisdiction over Sam's outdoor airings, meaning he wheeled him in the small carriage Clara had loaned them along the front of the house, with the gravity and diligence of someone carrying out a very important assignment. He spoke to Sam constantly during these airings in the way Maria had spoken to him in the kitchen, a monologue about everything in his field of observation, the color of the rocks, the behavior of the horses, the philosophical dimensions of the cat. Eli helped in ways that were less visible but equally constant, the wood restocked without prompting, the boys' laundry appearing in the washing pile already sorted, the schoolwork done without being chased. She found him one afternoon, thinking he was alone, reading to Sam from the Jules Verne book, sitting in the chair by the window with the baby on his knee and his voice lower and more gentle than she had ever heard it. And she stood in the doorway for a moment without disturbing anything, and felt the kind of gratitude that doesn't have adequate words. By the summer of 1888, the ranch had become the household it had been trying to become since before Maria arrived, maybe something even better than what it had been before, because it was built now on things that were clearer than they had been, on the honesty that Vernon had said he valued in his advertisement, and that Maria had tried to honor, on the trust that had been rebuilt in small pieces at a kitchen table with two boys who had refused every meal until the conditions of trust were met. One evening in July, with the heat lying heavy over the mountains and all the windows of the house open, Maria was at the stove making supper, Sam asleep in the cradle near the kitchen doorway where she could see him, Caleb sitting on the counter talking about a rock he'd found that he thought might be something significant, Eli at the table with his mathematics, Vernon on the porch, visible through the window, sitting in his chair with a book. She was talking while she cooked, as she always did, and what she said eventually drifted out through the open window to the porch, and she knew this because Vernon set down his book and came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her, and when she looked up and caught him watching, he didn't look away. He said, "What are you telling them?" she said. "The one about Colonel the Rooster." He said, "I haven't heard that one." Caleb said, "It's a very good story, Papa." She chased him for 3 years before she made friends with him. Eli said, without looking up from his book, "The other way around. The rooster chased her." Caleb said, "That's what I said." Eli said, "It wasn't." Maria said, "Both versions are correct, depending on who's telling it." Vernon came into the kitchen and sat at the table and said, "Tell it from the beginning." She looked at him across the warm kitchen, this man who had been lonely enough to put an advertisement in a newspaper, and honest enough to write it plainly and cautious enough to mean what he said. This man whose boys had refused every meal she offered until she sat down among them and talked while she cooked and learned that trust is built in the smallest and most ordinary ways, plate by plate and word by word. She told the story. All 4 of them listened. Even Sam stirred briefly in his cradle as if he was trying to catch the beginning of it. There was laughter, real laughter, the kind that fills a room and stays in it a while after it's technically finished. Eli laughed with his head back and his arms no longer crossed. Caleb fell off the counter with enthusiasm and got up immediately and demanded the next part. Vernon's laugh was low and steady, and had the quality of something that had been unused for a long time and was the better for being rediscovered. When the story was done, Supper was on the table. Maria called everyone in the way that had become a daily, ordinary ritual, a simple announcement, no ceremony required, and everyone came. 5 plates, 5 chairs. The lamp turned up against the early dark, the smell of food and cedar and the distant particular smell of the creek coming in on the evening air. Grace said, plain and short, and they ate. They ate and they talked, all of them, overlapping and interrupting and being corrected and starting over. The conversation of a family that has found its own specific language. And Maria sat among them and thought about the 300 miles she had traveled, and the advertisement that had said no frills necessary, and the boys who had refused everything until she sat down among them. And she thought about her mother's kitchen in Santa Fe, and the way her mother used to say that the kitchen needed conversation, the way the garden needed water. She had not known then that she would end up in this kitchen, in this territory, at this table, with this particular configuration of people who had come to mean more to her than she had known she was capable of meaning. She knew now. The months that followed brought the steady deepening of everything they had built. The Pharaoh matter was concluded completely by autumn. The man's authority entirely dissolved, and his interference in the land office permanently ended. The South pasture expansion proved itself in the fall cattle count, the herd stronger and better positioned than in any previous year. Pete retired at the end of October, returning to his daughter's family in California, and they gave him a proper send-off at the ranch with a supper that lasted 4 hours and ended with Clara Whitfield playing a fiddle she'd produced from somewhere and Pete dancing with a dignity and lightness of foot that surprised everyone. And Vernon saying things about Pete that were not many words but were every single right word. And Pete shaking Vernon's hand, and then looking at Maria and saying, "You're the best thing that happened to this place," which made her cry, which surprised her, because she did not cry easily. A new ranch hand came to replace Pete, a man named Thomas Reyes, 28 years old, who was from a Mexican ranching family in the Southern Territory, and who had the competence and self-possession of someone who had been working cattle since he could walk. Eli, who at 13 was beginning to develop the particular serious interest in ranch operation that suggested he would be a rancher himself someday if he wanted to be, began spending weekend mornings with Thomas learning the cattle management systems Vernon had developed. And Vernon told Maria one evening that watching Eli with Thomas was the first time he'd seen the boy look at the ranch the way he himself had looked at it when he was young, with genuine pride of ownership rather than the burden of it. Sam grew. Sam grew with the enthusiasm and conviction of a child who has decided to make the most of everything immediately. He pulled himself up at 8 months. He walked at 10 months, which everyone on the ranch regarded with the alarm appropriate to a child, who was clearly going to be a significant physical presence in a household that already had a great deal going on. He said mama at 11 months, clearly and with intention, looking straight at Maria, and she sat on the kitchen floor where she was when he said it, and held him for a long time with her face in his hair, and let herself feel the entire weight of what she had. Caleb, when he saw this, said with characteristic directness, "He said your name first." Maria said, "Yes." Caleb thought about this. "He said that's because you're in the kitchen the most, and the kitchen is where everything important happens," she said. "That might be the wisest thing anyone has said to me in a long time." Caleb said, "I know that. I'm a very observant person." Eli, from behind his arithmetic book, said, "He's also very modest." Caleb said, "I'm modest about things that don't matter." Vernon in the doorway said, "Where did you get that idea?" Caleb said, "From Maria." Vernon looked at her. She said, "I might have said something like that once." He said, "You've been philosophically corrupting my children," she said. "Someone had to." He smiled, full and genuine, the smile that she still found startling after more than a year of it, because it changed his face so completely, opening up the reserved lines of it into something younger and entirely unguarded. And she thought that she would never, for the rest of her life, get entirely used to that smile, and that this was probably exactly right. In the spring of 1889, she found she was expecting again, and told Vernon in the same East-light morning at the kitchen table, and he did the same thing, the same uncontained movement of joy across his face, and got up and made her coffee that was slightly better this time than the last. This time she told the boys together, and Caleb, now 10, said immediately, "I hope it's a girl," with the air of someone who has been giving this considerable thought. Sam, 18 months old and present on Maria's lap, said "Bah," which meant something specific that only he fully understood. Eli, 14, looked up from his book and said, "When?" She said, "October." He said, "I'll have finished the advanced arithmetic course by then." She said, "Good. Sam is going to need someone to teach him." Eli looked at Sam. Sam regarded Eli with enormous seriousness. Eli said, "He's going to be terrible at it." Sam said, "Bah." Everyone laughed, and it was that particular family laughter again, the kind that lives in the walls of a house long after it's technically over. And Maria thought, this is what we built, all of us together, this exact thing, this ordinary, extraordinary laughing life. The baby came in October as promised, and Caleb got his wish. A girl, born on a Tuesday afternoon with the autumn light going gold through the bedroom window and Clara Whitfield's steady hands and Vernon's steady presence. A girl with Maria's coloring, and unmistakably, Vernon's precise watchful eyes. They named her Eleanor. Maria had suggested it quietly to Vernon in the nights before the birth, when they had been talking in the dark the way they did, the real conversation that happened in the private dark hours. She had said she thought it might be time to give the name back to something good. He had been quiet for a long time. He had said, "Are you sure?" She had said, "She was their mother. She deserves to be remembered in something good." He had said, "You're the most generous person I've ever known." She had said, "I'm not generous. I'm practical. Children should be able to say their mother's name without grief being the only thing in it." He had held her hand in the dark, and she'd known he was thinking about things she couldn't fully see, the whole complex history of his first marriage and his grief and his anger and his forgiveness, which was still in progress and might be in progress for a long time, and she hadn't pressed on it. When Eleanor arrived, small and alert and equipped with opinions from the first hour, Eli came in and looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Maria. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Yes." He said nothing else. But the way he looked at the baby was careful and present and not burdened, the way a person looks at something that has been given back to them in a new and acceptable form, and Maria thought that she had been right, and that her mother's practical wisdom had not failed her. The ranch moved into its new season. 5 of them now, 6 counting Thomas Ray's, who had become as much a part of the daily rhythm of the place as the yellow cat. Sam tottered around the kitchen, getting in everyone's way with enormous self-satisfaction. Eleanor regarded the world from whoever's arms she happened to be in, with the watchful precision of her father's eyes. Caleb, 11 now, had begun corresponding with a natural history museum in San Francisco that had expressed interest in some of his rock and plant specimens, which made him so proud he could barely contain it, and so determined to contain it that he was visibly uncomfortable for 2 full days. Eli was 15 and growing into the serious mathematical mind his teacher had identified, and the ranch competence that was becoming its own distinct thing. And watching him with Vernon in the yard discussing cattle management with the ease of equals was something that made Maria's chest hurt in the particular warm way that good things did. One December evening, 2 years to the month after their marriage, Maria came into the kitchen after putting Sam and Eleanor down for the night and found Vernon at the table with 2 cups of coffee and the lamp turned low. He pushed 1 cup toward her without being asked. She sat down. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "I put that advertisement in the paper because Pete told me I had to do something about the situation or the ranch was going to fall apart." He meant the boys, the household, the practical things. He looked at his coffee cup. "I didn't believe anything was going to come of it. I didn't believe anyone would answer it, or if they did, that they'd last a week after they saw what they'd agreed to." He looked up at her. I want you to know that whatever I was expecting when you got off that stage, it wasn't this. I wasn't capable of expecting this." She said, "What is this exactly?" He said, "This, what we are, what you've made this place into." He paused. "What you've made me into, if I'm honest." She said, "I didn't make you anything. You were already there." He said, "Not all of it, not the parts that needed you." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked. Outside the window, the December stars were enormous and cold and specific. The same stars she'd looked at in New Mexico, and the same stars her mother had looked at in whatever kitchen her own small life had been built in. She said, "My mother used to say that a kitchen is the truest room in a house because you can't pretend in a kitchen. You're always actually doing something real, making food or cleaning up or building something actual." He said, "She sounds like she was worth knowing." "She was," Maria said. "You would have liked her," he said. "What would she have thought of me?" She considered this honestly. She said she would have taken a while to trust you. She was careful about quiet people, but once she trusted you, she would have been completely on your side. She paused. "She'd have told you that Eli was going to be all right. She could always tell." He said, "When did you know?" She said, "The night he said good night to me without being prompted. I knew then." Vernon was quiet for a moment. He said, "He told me something last week." She waited. "He said he was glad I married you." He said it quietly, looking at the table. He said it the way he says things, one sentence, no expression, and then he walked off to do something else. But he said it. She felt the warmth of it spread through her entire chest. She said, "He's a remarkable boy." Vernon said, "He is. They both are." He looked at her. "Because of you," she said, "because of you too. Because you loved them well enough that there was something there to reach." He looked at her for a long moment, the river water eyes steady and warm and entirely present. No distance in them, no reserve, just this, the direct and undefended gaze of a man who has come home to something he didn't know how to hope for. He said, "I love you, Maria." She had known it. She had known it in the way she knew the angle of the morning light, and the rhythm of the ranch, and the specific sound of his boots on the porch floor at the end of the day. She had known it in the coffee made slightly better than the time before and the blanket placed over her while she slept, and the way he said her name when he came into a room, with the inflection of a man who is glad of what he's found. She said, "I love you, Vernon." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his the way he had done on the day she said yes in the barn. And they sat in the kitchen in the December night with the fire and the stars and the sleeping children above them and the land outside holding steady in the cold. The ranch that was theirs, the life that was theirs, built in the most honest and ordinary way, plate by plate and word by word, one meal at a time. In the spring of 1891, Eli was accepted to a program in Tucson that would train him formally in engineering and applied mathematics. A path that would take him away from the ranch for extended periods, but that everyone agreed was right. And the acceptance letter was read at the supper table, and Maria watched Vernon's face across the table, and thought that the schoolteacher he had wanted to be was very present in his expression in that moment. The pride of a man who knows what it means to have a path and to be allowed to walk it. Eli went to Tucson in the fall of that year with a packed trunk, and a handshake from his father that became briefly an embrace, awkward and quick and entirely genuine, and a hug from Maria that he accepted fully and returned with the serious thoroughness of a boy who doesn't do anything halfway, and Sam trying to climb his leg, while Alina watched from the porch with her watchful father's eyes, and Caleb saying something about a letter every week. Eli, a letter every week. Which was his way of saying he was going to miss him more than he could express. Caleb grew into his natural history, and at 13 was corresponding with 3 different institutions, and had been described by one of them as having a remarkable observational mind, which he received with the same effortful modesty he brought to everything. He rode into Prescott on his own now, and spent Saturdays at the library with a thoroughness that Maria found entirely familiar, the intensity of a person who has found the thing they were built for. Sam grew into a child of spectacular energy and good humor, who regarded the ranch as his personal domain and the animals as his particular responsibility, and who talked in the way his mother had always talked. A running commentary on the world around him that filled the kitchen the way his mother's voice had filled it when he was small. And she listened to him now the way she had listened then, steadily and with attention. And she thought about all the kitchens in her life and all the talking that had happened in them and what it had grown into. Eleanor at 2 and then 3 was the most deliberate person on the ranch. She watched everything before she did it. She was neat in her movements and precise in her requests, and had, from the beginning, the particular quality of someone who misses very little. Vernon called her his observer, said it with a warmth that was not complicated at all, and she would climb into his lap in the evenings and watch the world from there with entire satisfaction. One morning in the summer of 1892, Maria was in the kitchen as always, Sam at her elbow now because he had decided he wanted to learn what Caleb knew, the stirring and the mixing and the small steady work of cooking, and Eleanor sitting on the counter watching with the attention she brought to everything. And Vernon came in from the morning chores and poured his coffee and stood in the kitchen not going back outside, which was unusual. She looked at him. He was looking at the kitchen. At Sam with his small hands in the dough, at Eleanor on the counter, at Maria at the stove. At the warm and occupied and talking room that the kitchen was, always was every morning the truest room in the house. She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yes." He paused. "I was just thinking about what this looked like when you arrived." She said, "Cold and quiet." He said, "Cold and quiet." Yes, he looked at her. "And now," she said, "now it's loud and warm and Sam has flour on his ear." Sam said, "I don't," and put flour on his other ear. Eleanor said from the counter with the seriousness of 3 years old, "You do now." Vernon laughed, the full and genuine laugh that had stopped being rare years ago, but that she never stopped being glad of. And he came and stood beside her at the stove, and she leaned slightly against his arm, and he put his hand at the small of her back, and they stood together in the warm, busy talking kitchen, while the morning light came through the east window and the fire in the stove kept its steady heat, and Sam narrated his efforts with the dough, and Eleanor monitored everything from the counter, and outside the yellow cat, very old now and much reduced in his ambitions, sat on the garden wall in the sun. She thought about the newspaper and the advertisement and the 300 miles and the first evening with the cold supper and the 2 boys who had refused everything she offered. She thought about sitting down and talking, about the way Caleb's almost laugh had happened before he meant it to and had started something. She thought about trust and what it cost and what it built. She thought about the dark past that had shaped this family and the secrets she'd uncovered, and the forced choices that had brought her here and the way that all of it, every bit of it, had led to this morning in this kitchen with this life around her. She turned slightly and she looked at Vernon and he was already looking at her. She said, "I love you," he said. "I know." He smiled. "I love you too," Sam said from the dough without looking up. "You always say that." She said, "Yes, because it's always true." Caleb rode in from Prescott that afternoon, brown from the summer sun, and carrying a new specimen wrapped in cloth that he was very excited about. And Eli's most recent letter arrived on the same day, full of news about his program and his work, and one line at the end that said simply, "Tell everyone I'm well and thinking of home," which was Eli's way of saying he missed them all. Maria read the letter at the supper table that evening, all 5 of them around it, the lamp up, the food steaming, the particular sound of this family beginning its daily conversation. She put the letter down. She looked at each of them, Vernon with his coffee and his evening ease, Caleb with his new specimen already in his pocket, planning what he would say about it, Sam explaining something to Eleanor who was probably not listening but appeared to be. And the letter from Eli on the table, his handwriting careful and deliberate and precise, thinking of home. She said grace. They ate. And the ranch went on, and the years went on, and the kitchen was always warm and always loud and always the truest room in the house, And the life they had made together was the life that had come from two people being honest in the specific and ordinary way that the West required, saying what you needed and meaning what you said and staying when it was hard, and trusting that the thing you were building would be worth the cost of the building. It was. It was worth every bit of it. It was everything.